Imagine 2 million people. No running water, no soap, no toilets, no toilet paper, no shade, just endless sand, a sky that burns like an open furnace, and the smell of thousands of bodies that hadn't bathed in weeks. This was the reality of the Exodus. And nobody talks about what it actually smelled like. Nobody talks about what it felt like to wake up every single morning covered in dust, your mouth dry, your skin cracked, your clothes stiff with dried sweat, and still have to get up, pack your tent, and walk. Just walk. Again. Because Moses said God said keep moving. We read the story of the Exodus like it's a spiritual epic. And it is. But it's also the story of 2 million human bodies trying to survive one of the harshest environments on Earth with almost none of the tools we take for granted today. No plumbing, no medicine, no refrigeration, no clean water on demand, no way to wash your hands before you eat, no way to clean the wound on your foot before it gets infected, just sand, sun, faith, and the desperate hope that the man with the staff knew where he was going. In 1300 BC, when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt and into the Sinai desert, they entered a world that would test every limit of the human body. And the details that the Bible skips over, the sweat, the filth, the disease, the smell, those details tell a story just as powerful as any miracle. Because surviving 40 years in the desert without modern hygiene is, in its own way, one of the most remarkable things those people ever did. If this kind of raw, unfiltered history is what you're looking for, follow this channel right now, share this video, and hit like. There is so much more where this came from. Let's start at the beginning, Egypt. Before the Exodus, most Israelites lived as slaves in Egypt. And Egypt, for all its cruelty, was one of the most hygiene-conscious civilizations in the ancient world. The Egyptians were obsessed with cleanliness. They bathed in the Nile regularly. They shaved their heads and bodies to prevent lice. They used a primitive form of soap made from animal fat and plant ash. They had perfumed oils to mask body odor. Wealthy Egyptians even had servants whose entire job was to pour water over them during bathing rituals. The priests of Egypt bathed multiple times a day. They saw cleanliness as a form of divine respect. Even for the enslaved Israelites, who had none of the luxuries of the Egyptian elite, the Nile was always there. The Great River, one of the longest in the world, provided water for drinking, cooking, bathing, and washing clothes. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't clean by modern standards, but it was water, consistent, available, and life-giving water. Then Moses came. And then the plagues. And then, one terrifying night, the Israelites gathered everything they owned, everything they could carry, and they ran. They left Egypt with the clothes on their backs, with unleavened bread they hadn't had time to let rise, with their children on their shoulders and their animals at their heels. And they crossed the desert border into the Sinai, and the Nile disappeared behind them. What lay ahead was one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. The Sinai Peninsula is not just hot. It is a specific, relentless, punishing kind of hot. During the day, temperatures regularly reached 45 degrees Celsius, over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun hits the sand, and the sand throws the heat back up at you from below, while the sky burns you from above. There is almost no natural shade. The ground is hard-packed dirt and jagged rock and rolling dunes that shift under your feet. The wind carries fine dust that gets into your eyes, your nose, your ears, your food, your water. It gets under your eyelids and scratches your corneas. It dries your lips until they crack and bleed. At night, the temperature dropped dramatically, sometimes below freezing. People who had been sweating all day were now shivering in thin desert air, their damp clothes pulling the heat out of their bodies. This cycle of extreme heat and extreme cold, day after day, week after week, destroyed the human body slowly and methodically. And there were 2 million of them out there. 2 million people is not a crowd. It is a city, a moving, breathing, eating, excreting city with no infrastructure whatsoever. Think about what a city of 2 million people produces every single day, just in terms of human waste. The numbers are staggering. A single human body produces roughly 200 grams of solid waste per day. 2 million people produce 400,000 kilograms of waste every single day in a desert with no sewage system, no pipes, no treatment facilities, just sand. The smell alone would have been something most modern humans cannot comprehend. We have sanitized our world so completely that many people today have never experienced what large numbers of humans living without sanitation actually smell like. Ancient travelers who passed through large encampments wrote about the odor as something physical, a wall of smell that you could sense from miles away. A combination of unwashed bodies, animal dung, rotting food waste, human excrement, and the metallic undertone of blood from daily animal sacrifices. This was the world Moses was navigating, not just spiritually, physically. And God, according to the text, was aware of the physical reality of the situation. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, contains what historians consider one of the oldest recorded public health laws in human history. It reads, and this is remarkable, that the Israelites were commanded to designate a place outside the camp for going to the bathroom. They were told to carry a small digging tool with their equipment, and when they needed to relieve themselves, they were to go outside the camp, dig a hole, and then cover their waste back up with dirt. Think about that. God gave Moses a law about where to go to the bathroom, not because God needed to, but because 2 million people in the desert without that law would have turned their camp into a biological disaster zone within days. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid. These diseases do not announce themselves. They spread silently through contaminated water and unburied waste. They kill children first, then the elderly, then the weak. Without that one simple law, dig a hole and cover it up, the Exodus might have ended not with a promised land, but with a plague of their own making. The fact that this law exists in the text tells us something profound. The people needed to be told, which means some of them weren't doing it, which means the camp, at least in the early days, was exactly as unsanitary as we might imagine. Water was the central crisis of desert life. Every human being needs at minimum 2 liters of water per day to survive. And in extreme desert heat, with physical exertion, that number climbs to 4, 5, or even 6 liters. For 2 million people, that means the minimum daily water requirement was 4 billion liters. 4 billion per day. There are no natural water sources in the Sinai that could supply anything close to that amount. The Bible records that God miraculously provided water on multiple occasions, most famously when Moses struck a rock at Horeb and water poured out. The Israelites also found water at various oases during their journey, but the consistent, desperate reality between those moments of miraculous provision was thirst, real, physical, dangerous thirst. And when water is that scarce, when every drop is a question of survival, you do not use it to bathe. You do not use it to wash your clothes. You do not use it to clean your cooking pots or rinse your hands. You drink it. That is all. And even drinking you ration. So how did people clean themselves at all? The answer is, they mostly didn't. Not by any standard we would recognize today. Dry cleansing was the primary method of personal hygiene in desert cultures throughout the ancient world. This meant using sand, fine dust, or rough cloth to scrub the skin. Sand has a mild abrasive quality. It pulls surface oil, dead skin cells, and some bacteria off the body. It doesn't sanitize. It doesn't kill pathogens. But it removes the top layer of grime and provides a temporary relative sense of cleanliness. Bedouin cultures in the same region practiced versions of this for thousands of years. You rub your body down with sand, shake it off, and move on. Hair was another challenge entirely. In Egypt, many people had solved the lice problem by shaving their heads entirely. Priests were required to do so, and many common people followed the practice. But in the desert, the scalp needed protection from the sun. So hair was typically kept and coated with a mixture of animal fat or olive oil, when olive oil was available, to create a barrier against the sun's ultraviolet radiation. This oiling of the hair was practical, not cosmetic. But it also meant that desert hair was essentially a grease trap for dust. Within hours of oiling your hair and walking through the sand, your head would be coated in a thick paste of fat and desert dust. Lice thrived in these conditions. Almost every person in the desert camp would have been carrying lice at some point during those 40 years. The skin itself suffered enormously. Extreme dry heat pulls moisture out of the skin relentlessly. Without oils or balms to protect it, skin cracks, first at the lips, then at the knuckles, then along the heels of the feet. These cracks bleed, and in an environment full of dirt and bacteria, small wounds became infections with stunning speed. The Bible records multiple instances of skin diseases spreading through the camp. Leprosy, or what the ancient Hebrews called zarath, which likely covered a range of skin conditions, including actual leprosy, psoriasis, and severe infections, was so prevalent that Moses was given detailed laws about quarantining the sick outside the camp. The feet deserve their own discussion. 2 million people walking on desert terrain every day. Sandals were the standard footwear. Thin soles of leather or woven plant fiber strapped to the foot with cords. They provided some protection against the scorching ground, but the sides and tops of the feet were fully exposed. Thorns, sharp rocks, scorpion stings, snake bites. The desert floor was a minefield at ground level. Blisters formed and burst and formed again. Calluses built up layer after layer. Feet bled. And the same ground they walked on was the same ground where thousands of animals urinated and defecated every day. The animals. We can't forget the animals. The Israelites traveled with enormous herds: sheep, goats, cattle, and donkeys. These animals were essential for food, for milk, for carrying loads, for sacrifice. But they were also another enormous source of biological waste. Animal dung covered the ground of the camp. Flies were everywhere. Flies that had just been on a pile of dung would land on your food a moment later. Flies carrying bacteria would land on the eyes of children and spread trachoma, an eye infection that was one of the leading causes of blindness in the ancient world. The flies of the desert camp were not a nuisance. They were a weapon of biological destruction that never stopped. Teeth were cleaned using what archaeologists call chew sticks. Small twigs from particular trees, stripped of bark at one end and frayed by chewing until the fibers separated into something resembling a brush. The neem tree, which grew in some parts of the region, was particularly prized for this, because neem has natural antibacterial compounds. People would chew one end of the stick and use it to scrub their teeth and gums. It worked to a degree. Dental decay was still rampant in the ancient world, but people who used chew sticks had notably better dental health than those who didn't. Toothaches with no dentist in a desert were not just painful. They could be fatal if an abscess spread to the jaw or brain. Food hygiene was, by modern standards, essentially non-existent. Meat was eaten quickly because there was no way to keep it cold. The manna that the Bible describes, the miraculous food that appeared each morning on the ground, was to be gathered fresh every day and not kept overnight, because it would rot. That instruction had a practical dimension beyond the spiritual. Keeping food overnight in desert heat is an invitation to food poisoning. The Israelites who tried to save manna overnight found it full of worms and stench by morning. God's command not to hoard the manna was also a public health directive. Water that sat in clay pots in the heat would develop algae and bacteria within days. There was no way to boil all the water all the time. Fire required fuel. Fuel was scarce in the desert. and boiling enough water for 2 million people daily was logistically impossible. People drank questionable water. They got sick. They recovered, or they didn't. Women's lives in the camp had particular burdens. Menstruation in the desert, without any of the products we have today, was managed using strips of rough cloth, linen or wool, that had to be washed and reused. Washing required water. Water was scarce. Childbirth happened in tents, on the ground, with no antiseptic, no sterile tools, no trained doctors. The maternal mortality rate in the ancient world was shockingly high by modern standards. Women died in childbirth regularly. Newborns died in their first days of life regularly. The camp was not just a community of survivors. It was a community that understood death intimately and personally, in a way that most people in the modern world do not. The elderly and the sick were the most vulnerable. When someone became too ill to walk, they had to be carried. When someone became too ill to be carried, they were left behind in a cart or on a stretcher, surrounded by family, waiting. There were no hospitals. There were no antibiotics. There was no surgery. The healers of the camp, likely a combination of priests, midwives, and experienced older women, worked with herbs, with prayer, with the laying on of hands, and with the kind of practical wisdom that comes from watching people live and die for generations. They knew which plants reduced fever. They knew how to set a broken bone with splints. They knew how to drain an infected wound. But their tools were limited, and the desert was merciless. And yet the Bible tells us they survived 40 years. An entire generation was born in the desert, grew up in the desert, and died in the desert, never seeing Egypt, never reaching the promised land, knowing nothing but this endless wandering. And a new generation rose up behind them, forged in the hardship. And it was those people, the children of the desert, who eventually crossed the Jordan and entered Canaan. What does it take to survive 40 years in those conditions? The immune systems of ancient people were built differently than ours. Children who survive infancy in a world full of bacteria and parasites develop extraordinary immune responses. The germ theory of disease did not exist. People didn't know that invisible organisms were killing them, but their bodies knew how to fight. Generations of survival in harsh conditions had selected, biologically, for people who were physically resilient in ways that would amaze us today. There was also community. 2 million people living in crisis together developed deep bonds. The camp was organized by tribe, by family, by clan. The elderly were cared for by their children. The sick were cared for by their neighbors. Food was shared. Labor was divided. Children were raised collectively. The social fabric of the Israelite camp was, in many ways, what kept it alive. You cannot survive 40 years in the Sinai desert alone. You survive it together, or you don't survive it at all. Moses himself, the man at the center of it all, lived this same life. The Bible describes him as a man who climbed mountains, who fasted for 40 days, who argued with God and with the people he led. He was a physical person living a physical life. He sweated in the same sun. He drank from the same brackish wells. He slept on the same hard ground. The image of Moses that we carry, the white-robed figure with the glowing face and the raised staff, is a spiritual image. The real Moses smelled like the desert. His feet were cracked and calloused. His face was burned dark by decades of sun. He was a man who had been through things that would break most people alive today. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson in all of this. We read the Bible looking for the miraculous, and the miracles are real and worth seeking. But we sometimes forget that the people in those stories were as human as we are. They had bodies that hurt. They had needs that were raw and unglamorous. They were afraid and sick and tired and dirty, and they kept going anyway. That is not a small thing. That is an extraordinary thing. The next time you read about the Exodus, about the pillars of fire and cloud, about the manna from heaven, about the water from the rock. Try to hold both realities at once, the miraculous and the physical, the spiritual and the smell, the God who parted seas and the people who hadn't bathed in 3 weeks, because that tension between the divine and the deeply human is where the real story lives. History is never as clean as the paintings make it look, and sometimes understanding how dirty it really was is the only way to understand how remarkable it really is.